Now to the moment we have all been waiting for. 14 August will mark exactly 2 years since the Bank of Ghana began the cleanup of the banking sector. Now, after taking down 13 commercial banks, the central bank is ready to create the environment for the remaining 23 banks to take on big-ticket transactions. In what will go down as the first exclusive interview to have been granted to any media house since his assumption of office, Governor of the Bank of Ghana, Dr. Ernest Addison, gives a step-by-step explanation of what and how it began the journey of sanitizing the banking sector. He spoke exclusively to my colleague Etonamse.
On the 14th of August 2017, we woke up to the news of the collapse of UT and Capital Bank. It was a shock to many, especially for those who did not see it coming. Little did we know that it was the beginning of a complete overhaul of the banking sector. 2 years on, we've seen a drastic reduction in the number of commercial banks from 36 to 23. It's been quite a journey for shareholders, employees, and the entire banking public. 2 years on, can we say that we have a more robust, resilient, and a more sanitized banking sector? There's so many questions begging for answers. Well, the man with all the answers is here with us. Governor of the Bank of Ghana, Dr. Ernest Addison, is our guest. Good morning, sir.
Good morning, good morning.
I'd like to say thank you, first of all, for this opportunity. I mean, you don't usually get the governor grants exclusive interview, so we know that this only shows the premium you place with respect to your relationship with the media.
Yes.
And we are grateful.
Yes, it's very important on a subject which is very important for this country.
2 years on, what will be your general overview of this cleanup exercise?
No, I think that we've ended, the 2 years with a more solid banking sector. These are banks that are well capitalized, they are more liquid, they are more profitable. I think the governance of the banks have also been strengthened. And all of this is with a view to improving stability of the system. And thereby, allow the banks to be more effective. Banks are there to provide credit to support growth. If you have weak banks or banks that are not liquid, that intermediation function is not, properly effected. So we think that our banks are in a better position to provide the necessary credit to fuel growth.
What would you say was your biggest challenge as governor taking on this exercise? We were told that, from a few of the comments you've made here and there, that the banking system was in a mess when you took over as governor. How bad was it?
Imagine walking in the very first week I walked into this office. I had a debriefing from the International Monetary Fund telling me that, well, you have inherited some good things and some not too good things. Among the not too good things were 9 banks which were significantly undercapitalized and needed recapitalization. Among the 9 banks were 2 banks that were insolvent, and we think that the licenses of these 2 banks have to go. This was in April 2017. We did our best between April and July to August before we took the decision to take out the licenses of UT and Capital Bank. Between that time, we spent a lot of time discussing with the shareholders recapitalization plans for those 2 banks. It became very clear after the due diligence that the situation with the banks were so bad, the level of insolvency was so bad that you could not get any investors that were interested in putting any more money into those 2 banks. And therefore, we had to revoke the licenses of those banks. It's not an easy decision to take.
Right. Was that your biggest challenge in the process?
Well, being the first ones, as you rightly said, we hadn't seen anything like that in the Ghanaian financial sector over the past 10 years. So it was a big deal. But as you can see, after a year, we took out 5, almost 5 banks at the same time, because we were getting, we were beginning to get a clearer understanding the problem.
So tell me, the whole process, I know that you have come up with a few structures.
It has to do with the corporate governance arrangements in the banking sector. If you look at the causes of the problems that we saw, some of it had to do with ownership in the banking sector and individuals who had too much say in terms of who gets credit, in terms of what the credit is used for and that sort of thing, because they had relatives on the boards were not functioning. So one of the things we did was to look at even the tenure of the managing directors of the banks, look at the tenure of board members and give them term limitations. So we have 4-year terms for these board directors, and I think the limit is a 12-year term. That is 3 4-year terms, after which you have to leave. Based on the fact that people get complacent, once you have stayed in an organization for too long, you tend not to stick to the rules of the sector, and we think that after 12 years you should have contributed, what you can to the institution.
Would you say that after we had a few of these banks, their licenses revoked, we've had a lot of back and forth, people have lost their jobs, we had managers who were taking their gross, was about 15,000, they were taking 2,000 because they had to be taken on by another bank, managers becoming tellers and cashiers. Do you think maybe we rushed the process?
No, I don't think that we rushed the process. I think if we had not taken those decisions, you would have seen queues at our banks. I'm sure you saw the events in the Midland Savings and Loans, which was all over the country. Imagine that happening across these 9 banks with customers queued up at the banking halls, struggling to get their money. This is what we have averted, because this is the sort of crisis that occurs where banks are not liquid, where the banks are not able to meet depositor withdrawals. You all end up queuing outside their banking halls and the chaos that comes with it. I think that by taking these decisions, we have been able to save depositors' funds. If you look at the number of depositors that have been protected, over 1 billion depositors' funds in the banking system. You also have over 1.5 million depositors in the microfinance sector.
Yes.
You look at the number of staff that have been absorbed by a consolidated bank. We have over 3,000 of these staff that are working at Consolidated Bank. These are people who could have lost their jobs if we had not intervened and we had allowed the system to collapse. So you have to look at it positively.
The people who lost their jobs, can we say that we have been able to absorb a majority of the
Quite
numbers?
a number of them have been absorbed by a Consolidated Bank. I do know for a fact that a few of them are being used by the receiver. The receiver has also hired quite a number of them to work. I know that there are a few other areas where they are supporting. Recently, we had to appoint an advisor to the National Investment Bank. That advisor has also, hired some of the executives that are in good standing, who were, in a way affected by the exercise.
Let's look at the recapitalization process. The issue of GATT will not go away. We have had, we are in July, and we still haven't received the 400 million each for these banks that were supposed to have been built out by Ghana Amalgamated Trust. Would you say that comments from people about the fact that we were unfair to the other banks whose licenses were revoked because they couldn't meet the amount?
Remember, the decision to revoke license, it was not only because of capital. We were also looking at governance. And no bank that was admitted to the GATT scheme had issues related to governance. Remember? That was the qualifying criteria, that the bank must be well run and well managed. Otherwise, GATT would not look at you. So those banks, those 5 banks that were admitted, except, of course, the State Bank, the NIB, which is in the class of its own, But I think that it's just the administrative processes. As I said, for us at the central bank, the government guarantee of providing the capital for those banks was enough for us to admit them as meeting the criteria. As we speak, I know for a fact that the resources have been made available to these banks.
The resources have been made available.
As we speak, the resources have been made available to these banks. But you have to speak with the GATT Secretariat to, explain the mechanisms, because they did not issue a bond, which was the original plan, that the GATT would be issuing a bond.
Did we know why?
I think you have to talk to the Secretariat to explain why they didn't go ahead to raise the bond.
Well, let me ask you this. I mean, these are questions that people, or rumors all over the place, that the finance minister, Ken Ofori-Atta, has an agenda to collapse a certain number of banks that belong to a certain party, and that you are supposed to be championing that cause.
It's unfortunate that people would be so mischievous to put this type of interpretation into a cause which I think is for the good of this country. Remember, these problems with the banks dated before us. In 2015, as far back as 2015, these recommendations had been made to the government of Ghana. And it's a problem that we inherited. It's a problem that we have tried to resolve. And I think the economy is the better for it.
What is the state of NIB?
NIB, as you know, is a state bank. It has issues with capital. It has issues with non-performing loans, because a lot of the loans were not granted through the proper channels. The risk management there wasn't very good. We have sent in an advisor to look at that bank and advise the central bank on the way forward. It seems clear that if we redefine the objectives for NIB, the management there should be able to turn it around as an efficient universal bank.
Is that what you see?
Well,
because the bank is saddled with a lot of problems. Like you said, MPLs.
They do have some problems, but these are surmountable. These are not problems that cannot be resolved. Remember, it's a state bank. A lot of the exposures there are government related also. So it's a quasi-fiscal problem, which would be resolved, once we get the fiscal authorities to be able to, in a sense, liquidate the exposures that they have at the bank.
Let's look at a few issues about the policy rate. I'll come back to the bank. We have had a steady, it's been steady at 16% for the last 4 quarters. How has that impacted credit disbursement in the country and its accompanying interest rates?
You have to understand that the policy rate is the reward that we get for sticking to the underlying adjustment policies, and we have been moving in tandem with the improvements that we see in the inflation rate. So we've been able to bring down the policy rate from 25% to 16. That's almost 900 basis points of adjustment. I think the point you are raising is on the lending rates, whether the lending rates have responded to these policy actions. Yes, to some extent they have, but we don't think that we have seen the full impact. And we think that the lending rates could probably go down a little more than where they currently are. If you talk to the banks, they will tell you about the non-performing loans being a major factor. If 24% of your portfolio is non-performing, then the rest of the 75 or so of the portfolio would have to generate the resources to keep the bank going. And therefore, until we are able to drive NPLs into single digits, it will be very difficult to push lending rates into single digits. I think this is where we all want to go. We want to see interest rates go into single digits, it means that the non-performing loans will also have to go down.
One of the key expectations of the recapitalization and the sector reforms was to inject additional capital into the banking sector to enable the banks take on big tickets. How much would you say came in as fresh capital, given that some of the big and foreign banks only transferred existing funds from their income surplus accounts?
I had that data somewhere.
Okay.
Maybe I should look for it for you. But
okay.
The data is very clear that we had nearly 4 billion of additional capital being raised into the banks. I don't think that 4 billion cedis is insignificant.
So we are looking at some 4 billion cedis.
Yes, at the minimum. I'm looking at the domestic currency inflow was about 4 billion. And then we had some, I think, $300 million also external capital inflow. Right.
But has that impacted on the ability of Ghana-based banks to take on big-ticket transactions?
Oh, clearly. I mean, if the bank has more capital, they should be able to do more. I think the banks are being a little cautious because of the non-performing loan problem, and also because for now they are able to invest in safer government paper. But as the macro improves, as interest rates on government paper go down, they will be forced to look for other venues to utilize the resources.
So as it stands, we don't have our local banks taking on yet? No,
the private sector credit growth is increasing. I think that we saw a rate of almost 17% year on year in June this year, which is a major departure from what we saw last year when private sector credit was very low, about 8% or so.
Now, credit disbursement is still relatively weak, given that the data we are seeing from the Bank of Ghana over the last 2 quarters since the reforms ended. What would you say is the cause of the slow pace, really? Is it the issue that private sector, which is the biggest consumer of bank credit, is kind of fatigued in the time being, or banks are still adjusting to the aftermaths of the reform?
The private sector credit is picking up. So yes, a year ago you saw private sector credit grow at 8% or so, which was really part of the adjustments after the reform. But in 2019, that picture has, begun to change. Remember also that in 2018, you had Consolidated Bank, which had just been set up. It's a very big bank. It wasn't yet very active. And in 2019, you've had Consolidated Bank also, improving. So we see total assets of the banking industry growing significantly in this year.
Government finances are not going as planned, and that's already creating gear that we would end the year with a deficit higher than programmed. Are you worried that a derailment of the fiscal will more like reverse the few gains you're beginning to make in the banking sector? Are you worried?
I think you're going too far on that issue. The issue on the fiscal is not that we are expecting that it will derail. We think that it's an issue that will be corrected. You have seen some increase in the deficit in the first half year. This is why the mid-year review was done. The minister has, come out with new measures, including increases in the ESLA. And we hope that that would help improve the revenue flows to the budget. And that should help reverse the trend that we have seen in the first half of this year. So we are hopeful. We don't think that the budget would end, with a deficit which is higher than projected.
We are preparing for 2020. I mean, we're looking at, elections are usually marked by humongous expenditure. What should we expect in 2020?
I do not expect anything different in 2020. As you know, we have a fiscal responsibility law, which ties the hands of the government to a ceiling of 5% deficit. I do not expect that this would change even in an election year. The Bank of Ghana has a memorandum of understanding with the government government to have a zero financing of the budget. So we do not intend, contributing to the financing of the budget, even in an election year.
What will be, you've spoken about the fact that we have a more robust banking system. You haven't told us how much it costs us to clean up the system, and also moving forward, the next step.
I'm glad you've brought this issue because the government's intervention through the issue of bonds of almost $12 billion is not where the process ends. The process should end when the shareholders, the directors of these banks, who have plundered the resources of these banks, are taken to court, and the assets that they have acquired with these resources are retrieved in order to pay back, the resources that the government has spent. So until we finish with the judicial processes, I think that the cleanup is not completely done.
So the judicial process is what is really a problem for many. We haven't seen people whose names have come out.
I think you should give them some time.
Prosecuted.
I think you should give them some time. I know they are working hard at it, and hopefully before the year end, we'll see some of these cases.
And so this case is with the courts now, or it hasn't gone to the court yet?
I know that there are some preparations towards that.
That the people involved will be prosecuted as a deterrent to those.
I know that there are some processes towards that. So let's wait and see what happens.
By the end of the year, we should see something. Okay, Governor, we are grateful for your time this morning, for the opportunity you've given us. So you're telling us that we will not know how much it costs to clean the sector until we are able to prosecute or bring finality to those who will.
So we know how much it costs the sector to, refund depositors' money. But I said that we need to also try to recover what we have lost through, shareholders and directors who misappropriated the resources of these banks.
But the recovery is not in your hands.
Well, the receiver is at it. He's been able to recover some, but there are still quite a lot of, resources out there that need to be recovered. Broadly, it gives the Ghanaians opportunity to have confidence in the banking sector, because today that if you walked into any bank that is licensed by the Bank of Ghana, you should expect that these banks will be in a position to honor your deposit requests. These are banks that can provide you with loans, credits, and banks that are in a sense more efficient than what we found 2 years ago.
Our next stop with the financial sector cleanup.
We are almost done. The last segment, savings and loans, finance houses, I think we should be able to finish these before September.
Thank you so much, Governor. We are grateful for your time this morning.